Hello world, Agustin Cortez coming to you live from Web3. And if it's your first time watching these videos, essentially what I do is I sit down and I articulate the lessons and the buildings that I am working on in Web3. And today I sat down and I wrote in detail, essentially the philosophy, layer zero of Web3 and blockchain. So to give the premise of this, we have to take a look at the history of the internet, right? We have to take a look at what Web 1 was, what Web 2 was, and what Web 3 is becoming. And from there, it leads to the introduction to blockchain because Web 3 is built on the premise and the infrastructure of blockchain because blockchain allows a decentralized ledger to be the source of truth. And once that's involved in the picture, you can have an economy because the exchange of value is done in a new way. But to focus on the subject of the philosophy in layer zero of Web3, I want to give the origin story and the uprising. I believe I've done a video on this, but it's always good to refresh the concept. And to start off, let's actually first talk about the internet, right? So in the 1970s, I believe the US government was working on essentially government programs to do essentially military and defense programs. And one of the processes that came around was an internet, where it was a device of computers that were hardwired and connected to each other. So computer A was connected to computer B was connected to computer A and C, or how many computers that there were. And this created the internet, where this network was between the physically connected devices. And this was the way that the internet was operating, but where a huge novel change came around in the 1990s, specifically in 1989. And this is when Tim Berners, who is an English scientist, invented the World Wide Web. And this is where Web 1 was born, because internet, or I should say the devices, can now tap into a global internet where they didn't have to physically be hardwired or programmed into it. The World Wide Web allowed for a browser, allowed for websites, and allowed for the devices to exchange information through pipelines, usually copper, or it evolved to like vacuum tubes where light would travel. And what ended up happening is devices can now communicate to one another without being physically in the internet, in their physical internet, peripheral internet. Now the internet was a World Wide Web. So this was the origin of Web 1. And what was done here was a read access, where the browser introduced protocols usually known as hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP. And this is how a server, which is like a memory box, was able to send and deliver information to a device. So the protocol would say device is requesting the code from this website, which is a domain, usually just an IP address. This IP address lives in this memory box, in this server. Here's what the server has for this IP, or this IP address, this domain, sends the code back to the device, and the device renders it. And this is called reading access. When you work with programming, you get aware of protocol processes with read, write, delete, and update accesses. In this case, it's just a read access where individuals can request and read the information sent from the server. So this is Web 1. Literally, all you can do is read information from the server, and your device can only render it. Now, where the innovation happened and where Web 2 came to an emergence was when it allowed for read and write access. And what this simply is when users and devices can now send data to the server, and then that server add data to the database. This is what applications, this is what websites, this is what essentially the internet that we know of pre-Web3 does, right? When you go to, say, twitter.com and you post a tweet, what you're doing is you have the right access to add a tweet from your account to Twitter's database of all the tweets that exist, right? And then what the data or the tweet does is it gets stored in the database and then it gets rendered out to the users who follow you or who look up for your tweet. And this data became a commodity, it became a product. And this is where Web2 applications really wanted to focus on data, because data can now be a product. The more data that can be used, the more content, the more product that they can build, and also the more algorithms that they can create and leverage news feeds. And this created a really, really interesting flywheel of human innovation. And it's where the tech focus was around for a couple years, or over a couple years. And the main form of revenue through this was advertising, right? Because advertising allowed for the capturement of attention and monetize off that. And with algorithms, they would have a very strong sticky effect where people would consume more ads would be displayed, and this business model of FANG, essentially, that we know of came to be. Now, where things start to break away and where we're entering now is Web3, where it's a device now has read, write, and what they're calling own, where you get ownership of the data. So before I dive into this, let me explain the pitfall of Web2, where you are only allowed to write. So in the case of using Twitter, the same example, when you write data to Twitter's database, your data is just sent over. You get nothing in return. Sure, you get likes, comments, gain followers, but you're not getting a direct return of the revenue and the profit of Twitter's business, right? You're doing the work. Twitter doesn't create content. The users create content. The users literally create the data, send it to the database, and Twitter benefits from that. They get the revenue, the money, all the perks of owning that data. And what do the users get? They get intrinsic social dynamic value, where sure, it's work, but at the end of the day, seeing the contrast that it could be, this is exploitation of users, because if the users don't exist, and these platforms have nothing, right? So there should be an exchange of value between the users that are making the products work in the first place. So this is where Web3 comes in with the ownership. So now the data can be tied to the blockchain. So this might be a little bit more complicated to explain, but I'll do my best here. The fall off with Web2 is that every company has its own database. Twitter has its own database, Facebook has its own database, Amazon has its own database, and so on. What ends up happening is that users have to go into these sanctions, has to go into the Facebook database, has to go into the Twitter database. And once it makes it their account, they have to do the information, upbuild it, and essentially start over whenever they go to another platform. This is where a blockchain is very prevalent, because a blockchain is a shared ledger, meaning that the data that goes into the blockchain is accessible to everyone since it's a shared ledger. So let me give an example of this. So let's say Twitter was built around the blockchain, right? Well, Twitter was built on the blockchain and Facebook was built on the blockchain. So if I'm a user of Facebook and of Twitter, all I have to do is use my private and public keys to sign authorization, and all the data that gets tied to my address could get pulled to either platform, because the data and the database, I should say, is the blockchain. So since it's not siloed, since the data is not sitting in Twitter nor Facebook specifically, it's sitting in the blockchain, the platforms are just rendering. They're just talking to the database and say, oh, hey, Augustine's here. Here's his wallet. What wallet data does this have in the blockchain? And then they'll just simply render it. So this is a magical moment in the terms of accessibility for the internet user. And here is where we get to see the power of ownership. So let's say the wallet address creates a piece of content that generates a lot of revenue for the business. And this business is using the blockchain, right, as a database. Now, through data and algorithms, that piece of content can be calculated to really formalize the attribute of revenue that is being brought in by that specific wallet address. Excuse me. So let's say that I did a tweet that went viral and it made this blockchain Twitter $100. And when I signed up for Twitter, for this decentralized Twitter, I was aware that I would get 50% of the commissions. So the data of these decentralized Twitters rendering information sent from addresses from the blockchain, and it displays it, and that's their product, right? But now each address is tied to the product, which is the data, and the DApp, decentralized app, this decentralized Twitter is making money by creating this platform. Then if they made the $100 and the commission is 50%, then it's tied. It's automatically synced that Augustino is the owner of the wallet, send 50% of the commission of the revenue to this address. So now the user gets rewarded for the work because their data, which is the product, is open to the database, and the database is what the product is using. So it's essentially, the internet has a universal database. This is the goal with Ethereum, with it being the singleton computer. But blockchain is still in its infancy stage. We're seeing scalability issues. We're seeing a lot of hiccups along the road, and we're going to see interoperability between chains. But basically, this premise of having a shared and open source of truth is going to change the way that business and products are done, because it's giving ownership to users now, and that's Web3. It's read, write, and ownership. So we're entering this new phase of products and systems emerging with ownership, and people have skin in the game now. Like, there's platforms out there like Hive that reward the contributors, that if you get upvotes and people view your content as relevant, you get Hive tokens, or I don't know exactly what token they call it, but you get an ERC20 token that is backed by a liquidity pool, and you can exchange for another token or literally convert it to a fiat currency. So your work is, in terms of valuable, in terms of money. So the users now have ownership of their product, and the platforms are giving back to the users. And this is a very, very powerful thing, because for decades, people have been pumping content and getting the scraps, YouTube ad revenue share, and Twitter. You don't get paid on Twitter. Facebook, sure, you may be for an influencer, but the form of businesses and tech and processes are going to change, because the users are now going to have the ability to get paid, and they should, right? They're the ones creating the product in the first place. So that's the overview of what Web3 is emerging. I'll conclude it here. I want to talk further maybe tomorrow about what a blockchain is, specifically talking about consensus protocols or consensus mechanisms, the type of attacks that blockchains can face, how a blockchain works with hashes, nonces, and how any change to the data will essentially break the chain, how to fork a blockchain, and those type of questions. All right, so I hope this was insightful. I really enjoy hearing back from people saying, hey, the video was interesting, or if there's any comments, feedbacks, more than happy to hear those out. All right, so thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.